I am thrilled to be back here. It has been too long. I don't know, it's been maybe a year or less, but either which way, it's been too long. Glad to be back with my dear friend and mega scholar, Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, who, in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of scholar friends of mine, is the top scholar when it comes to this issue. I'm going to have to recommend, by the time this airs live for everybody, I'm going to have the links down there where you can find his books, which have been incredible help to me in prepping for work that I do as an apologist, as well as great audible audiobooks that he has out there. And I want to ask you, brother, Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, how have you been, brother?
I've been well. Thank you so much, William. I'm really, really happy to be with you, and grateful for the time to exchange some ideas. Only that I'm embarrassed by that introduction. I'm not a mega scholar in my own estimation, just a humble student of religion. So, but really, really happy to be with you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Reynolds. You have incredible work, and again, it's been very helpful for me. And recently, I had a very interesting exchange and debate. I have a lot of debates with Muslim individuals, scholars, and what have you, because it really is an area, Muslim apologetics and dialogue with Catholics is an area that I have a lot of interest in, particularly because it really is an area where not a whole lot of people are doing stuff when it comes to Catholics. You're one of the very few, so I really tap into your work a lot, read your stuff a lot, and today I'm very excited to pick your brain on a lot of really interesting things. One particular area that I have, when preparing for a debate I recently had, and we were doing a little bit of work within Islam, found that there's not a whole lot out there outside of the great material you've done from a Catholic perspective that covers what us Catholics would call our Holy Immaculate Mother Mary, comparing the way we view Mary to the way the Qur'an or the way Islam views Mary. Interestingly enough, there are a lot of things that we agree upon. One thing that I was shocked to learn, and I'm sure you can elaborate on it perhaps, is that, and this Dr. Musharraf Hussain and multiple other scholars have told me that within Islam, there's a very similar view to Mary being without sin, all immaculate. Would that be correct to say, or would we have to word it differently?
Great question to raise. Mary is often put forward as a bridge between the church and Islam. There's a scholar at Benedictine University named Rita George Tverkovich who has written a book on this. And more broadly, in dialogue between the Catholic Church and Islam, Mary is often seen as like, this is a good place to start. You probably know, William, that in the Church's Vatican II document, Nostra Aetate, in the third section there, which deals with Islam, there's an explicit sentence which speaks of Muslims. I think it says something to the effect of, and at times call on her with reverence. So the Church itself recognizes in that Vatican II document, Nostra Aetate, that Mary has an important place in Islamic spirituality. So yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it would seem like this is a good place to find common ground. On the specific question of possibly Mary's conception without sin in an Islamic point of view, and on Mary's sinlessness generally, so not only her conception without original sin, but her sinlessness, there's a couple of things to say. Now, the first thing is, as you know, no doubt, the nativity of Mary is alluded to in chapter 3 of the Qur'an. So Qur'an is a book, has 114 chapters. Arabic is known as surahs. Chapter 3 is known as the family of Imran. And now why is it called the family of Imran? Because Imran is the name given to Mary's father in the Qur'an. We could speak about that further. Maybe we'll get there. But in any case, in this chapter, we have a couple of lines towards the beginning of the chapter given to Mary's mother. She's only referred to as the wife of Imran, which is interesting. Mary, as you know, is the only woman named by name in the Quran. No other woman is referred to by name. So Mary's mother is referred to only as the wife of Imran. She offers a prayer in which she says, I consecrate to you, God, that which is in within me and her descendants, in allusion to Jesus, from Satan. And on the basis of this verse, I think we have the birth of traditions which are not in the Quran, but are given to Muhammad. So these are traditions known as hadith, sayings of Muhammad, in which he says at the birth of every single child, with only two exceptions, Satan comes and touches the child, for which reason the child cries. In the two exceptions, he doesn't mention himself, he mentions Mary and Jesus. So there are some traditions like that which would suggest not only that Mary is sinless during her life, but that she was conceived without sin.
Really incredible. One particular, and I don't know if I can pull it up right now, one particular translation of that I found, and I found it in the book of Virtuous Qualities, says that neither Jesus nor Mary, well, tell me this is correct, neither was pricked by Satan.
Yes.
Is that, would that be correct or an iffy translation?
There's more than, if I'm not mistaken, there's more than one word used. I believe some traditions use the word which basically means to touch, but another word, it might be ta'ana in Arabic. I think it's ta'ana, but I could be mistaken. It could be translated as pricked. Exactly, meaning stabbed, basically. This sort of symbolic language of sort of the violence of Satan, who seeks to do harm, you know. So yes.
That truly is incredible, because I've done a lot of work in Mariology, particularly in the Immaculate Conception, and it really does remind me of the language of a lot of early church fathers. One particular one that comes to mind is the great Saint Ephraim, who incredibly similarly says that only you, referring to Christ, only you and your mother were pretty much in essence without stain. And it talks about them not being under the dominion of the devil. Very similar language.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, probably not a coincidence. I wanted to say, William, that the Quran, there's so many signs that the Quran is picking up, especially on the Syriac language Christian tradition, with figures such as Ephraim, Jacob of Sarug, excuse me, and others who have this rich theology around all of the Old Testament figures, and then finally around Mary and Jesus. In the Quran's what seems at times surprising, almost jarring veneration for Mary and Jesus, which seems almost to sort of be in friction with later theological dogma of Islam. For example, the story of Jesus creating a bird from clay, the Arabic word khalaqa, which is an act otherwise ascribed only to God. Jesus in the Quran creates a bird from clay. This is a story that's widespread in the early church, which we could speak on more if it's interesting. But here we find it in the Quran. So the Quran seems to be drawing on these traditions, but nevertheless sort of holds a clear theological line that Jesus was not God, was not Son of God, was not Savior, etc.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Now, one thing you did bring up that really, really does fascinate me, and I did a very deep dive of research not long back on the issue of Mary's father in the Quran and within Islamic, the theological system of Islam is a man by the name of Imran. Very interesting, because I've read, and I have to say, Dr. Reynolds, so many commentaries, a lot of them conflicting, and recently I just had a debate, as I was saying earlier, with a scholar, doctor, who was saying, and I wanted, I give everybody the benefit of the doubt. During the debate, one of the questions that I asked him was, I realized that biblically, the name of Mary's father is not in Scripture. But very early on, as early as the 100s, as you would know, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, and then built into the liturgical life, century after century, you have Joachim and Anna as the names of Mary's parents. And of course, the name Hannah, Anna, very same name, and there's no issue there. Whereas a Catholic, it brings up alarm bells for me, is we do have Imran, which is, I utilized, as you know very well, within scholarly databases, we have the TLG, the Thesaurus Lingua Grece, and various other databases that we can utilize from Christian writers. I was never able to find any that ever utilized that name. So it had me really wondering, where on earth did Muhammad get this from? You tell me what you think. I've read some scholars say that that is just a variant of the name Joachim. And then I've had some say that no, well, you know what? This is the correctly preserved name. Joachim is incorrect. Is there a definitive position within Islam? And in your estimation, have you ever found anyone before we get to Muhammad that utilizes this name for the father of Mary?
Yeah. So the first point is, to my knowledge, there is no pre-Quranic text that refers to the father of Mary as Imran, as the Arabic has it, or in the Hebrew, and we'll get to this, the connection with the Hebrew Bible, as Amram. Yeah. So there's no text. So I mean, and that sets up the problem, right? Because Muslim scholars then themselves were aware of the problem, and I'll sort of set up the problem a bit more. And then later, when you get to the Orientalists and Western scholars generally, they try to sort of unravel the knot of why the Quran is referring to the mother of Mary as Imran. I mean, the problem is actually more complicated, because in Quran chapter 19, Mary is also referred to as the sister of Aaron.
Yeah.
And the reason why all of this, great, yeah, reason why all of this seems to be complicated for the Quran is that we know from the Old Testament that the father of both Aaron and Moses and Maryam was named Amram. And so here we have, and now keep in mind that in Arabic, there's no distinction between the New Testament Mary in terms of name, in the Old Testament Maryam. In English, we have the distinction, but in Arabic, it's just Maryam. Maryam is the name for both the New Testament, Old Testament figures. So here we have the Quran referring to Mary as sister of Aaron, and Mary's father as Imran, and then the Bible is saying, oh well, the father of Aaron and Moses and Maryam, Old Testament Maryam, was Amram, and it seems to all fit together, where the Quran simply has some sort of confusion, and it's hard to go back and sort of imagine step by step what actually went down, but the Quran has some sort of confusion between the Maryam of the Old Testament and the Mary, which in Hebrew would be Maryam, of the New Testament, Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, just to give a fair hearing to those who try to save the Quran from a simple error, and it's worth noting, William, this is like, I mean, to use a phrase my kids would use, this is the vibe in Quranic studies scholarship. That is, there's a consistent concern from scholars, both Muslims and non-Muslims, to avoid the possibility that there's error in the Quran. So even non-Muslims, and I mean, it's complicated. It has to do with like social, cultural concerns with Islamophobia, accusations of Orientalism. All these things sort of are wrapped up, and it leads to a culture in which, in Quranic studies scholarship, like the idea that there's an error in the Bible, in the Quran, of course, is just sort of unthinkable. So people always try to find ways to avoid saying there's an error. So how do they do it in this case? Well, often what people do, and different scholars have written on this, including really critically thinking scholars, is to say, well, what's going on is that Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Blessed Virgin Mary, is associated with the temple, and the temple is associated with the priests and the Levites, and Aaron is symbolic of the priests and the Levites generally, and that's the reason why Mary is referred to as the sister of Aaron, not because there's a confusion with the Old Testament and the New Testament Marys, but because the Quran almost brilliantly, eloquently, in a sophisticated way is calling to mind Mary's association with the temple. And they would add to that in chapter 3, Mary, and this follows from the Proto-Evangelium of James, chapter 3 of the Quran, Mary seems to be in the temple. Now, the Arabic word used there doesn't mean literally temple. We could speak about it more, but Mary seems to be in the temple. And so they would try to draw this together, and they might say, oh, and also there are prophets in the Quran who call themselves the brother of their people. So when the prophets in chapters like 7, 11, 26, some other chapters, they introduce themselves, or the Quran will say of them, the people Ad had their brother Hud sent to them. And so they would say the way the Quran uses brother and sister is symbolic. It doesn't actually mean biological relationship.
Right.
So those are some of the strategies used to sort of avoid the possibility that there's error and confusion. I mean, I suppose they're possible. It's hard to know in a compelling manner.
Yeah.
But that one finds both sister of Aaron and daughter of Imran, makes it seem possible at least. By the way, Muslim commentaries, I'll shut up here. Wait a minute a second.
No, you're great. You're great.
All right, thank you. But the Muslim commentaries, including the classical commentators, I believe it's in Tabari, who's a 10th century commentary, dies in 923. They recognize the problem.
Yeah.
So they say, wait, why is the Quran speaking of Mary as the sister of Aaron? And they would say when Aaron and Moses lived many generations before Mary, and they would say some among our Muslim brothers say, no, she really is the sister of Aaron. Mary, the mother of Jesus, really is the sister of Aaron, and consequently, the sister also of Moses. But Tabari, if I'm remembering correctly, someone might catch me on this one, but I think Tabari says, no, this is not reasonable historically. There has to be a different explanation, and he gives 5 or 6 different ways of justifying why the Quran calls Mary the sister of Aaron.
That was great, Dr. Reynolds. That was fantastic. You're right. I really appreciate how you show that Muslims seem to have been very well aware of this. Let's look for the sake of giving them a fair hearing. This apparent error, this apparent problem. I've always been fascinated by Sahih Muslim, where you clearly have the Christians questioning this. I'm pretty sure you're aware of this, where it says, when I came to Najran, they, the Christians of Najran, asked me, you read, O sister of Aaron, in the Quran, whereas Moses was born much before Jesus. When I came back to Allah's messenger, I asked him about that, whereupon he said, the people of the old age, I'm sure you're aware of this, used to give names to their persons after the names of apostles and pious persons who had gone before them. Now, granted, that it does seem possible, but to me, it's a very, 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 very incredible coincidence that we've got nowhere in history do we have this figure being named as her father, other than the connection you find in the Old Testament, where you've got this figure Aaron being the sister of Miriam, which, as you know, you Arabicize that becomes Maryam. Am I correct with that? Yep. That is how you pronounce it.
Yes.
To me, in my studies, you correct me if I'm wrong, I said, okay, well, look, when it comes to the Quran, where it says sister of Aaron, you know what? Okay, well, maybe that is possible, but it really does seem to me everything that I read in the Quran is presenting the figure, the father of Mary, Imran, as a historical figure, a real historical figure. There's no ability to spiritualize that. And even if we try to answer away, in my opinion, the apparent error of Aaron being her actual physical brother, it's a bit of an issue to overcome the issue of where you have it. She's being called the daughter of Imran. To me, everything that I read is very clear. It's attempting to present Imran as the actual father of Mary, because then we read that she is the wife of Imran. The wife of Imran said, my Lord, I have pledged to you what is in my womb, consecrated. So accept from me, indeed, you are the hearing, the knowing. So would it be correct to assume that Imran and Hannah, or Anne, as we refer to her in Christian theology, Catholic theology in particular, that these are presented as historical figures? That's what it seems like to me within the Quran, within the Islamic theology. Would that be a fair assessment?
I would say so. I think it might be helpful to put it in the context of other passages where we see a departure from the biblical tradition.
Right.
So, I mean, I could just name a couple if it's helpful, and it sort of contextualizes what may be going on with Mary. Yeah. So, I mean, one of these is the question of Joseph, the Old Testament Joseph, was taken out of Egypt, and in the Bible, only only his father Jacob comes down to Egypt in the end. In the Qur'an, both Jacob and Rachel come down. And it seems to be clear because the Qur'an alludes to both of his parents being in Egypt with him in a dream that Joseph has at the beginning of Surah 12. So Rachel dies in the biblical text, Rachel dies earlier. Another example of this is that in the Qur'an, Moses seems to be adopted by the wife of Pharaoh and not by the daughter of Pharaoh. And not only that, but in the Qur'an, the Pharaoh of Moses' childhood seems to be still on the throne when Moses is an adult, because he refers in Quran 26 to Moses and he says, don't you know, this is when Moses comes back from Midian and confronts Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, didn't we raise you? Didn't you spend years of your life with us? But in the biblical text, the very reason why Moses returns from Midian to Egypt is because the Pharaoh who was seeking his life, the first Pharaoh, is dead and a new Pharaoh is on the throne. So he feels safe going back to Egypt. There's a bit in the Quran where the story where the prophet Nathan tells a parable, sort of just a symbolic parable about sheep to David in the Old Testament. It's a parable, but in the Quran, it's either Surah Safat or Sa'd. I think it may be Sa'd, but I could be getting it wrong, which is 38. In the Quran, these figures who are part of Nathan's parable become real figures who actually meet David and ask David to judge between them. So, I mean, what's going on with Mary seems to be part of a larger trend. And I mean, there are more examples. I don't want to go on and on, but there are more examples of this. I mean, another really prominent one is in the Quran, Noah has a son who's lost in the waves of the flood. That's in Quran chapter 11. This is in the Quran. In Genesis, Noah has 3 sons. They all are saved in the ark. Not in Quran 11. One of the sons is lost in the flood. So, so there are different ways of arguing about this. I mean, one is the Quran just doesn't know the details of the Bible very well. And so is sort of grabbing material that it thinks is useful for its own articulation of theological points. But because it doesn't know the material well, it reshapes it in ways that lead to a deviation from the biblical story. Or maybe the Quran doesn't consider the Bible authoritative, and so it feels itself to be free to rearrange, reshape, make Mary the daughter of Imran, make Noah have a son who's lost in the flood, so on and so forth. So it's really hard to differentiate between those possibilities. And is the Quran really aware of the Bible and intentionally changing it, or is the Quran just not aware of the Bible and was the Quran's author just maybe doing the best he could without solid knowledge of biblical stories?
Those are great points, and it does bring me to my next question. When it comes to the Bible, this is one that comes up very often, Dr. Reynolds. With that in mind, would he have been in possession of an Old and a New Testament as we have them today? Is there any scholarly evidence that he would have been aware of them at all?
Well, my answer is certainly not.
Right.
Definitely not. But I want to give a shout out there to a really incredible scholar at Princeton University named Jack Tannous.
Okay.
Who is about 10 times smarter than me. So this is why I sort of hesitate. And he thinks, well, whether or not, he would probably say, whether or not Muhammad himself had a copy of the Bible in Arabic is impossible to know. But he is inclined to say that there was a translation, at least a partial translation of the Bible in Arabic by Muhammad's day. I think that at least with our current state of knowledge in regard to the Bible and its translation to Arabic, it seems very likely that the Bible was not translated into Arabic. So biblical knowledge would have passed to the Quran's author orally, so through oral traditions. Yeah. So we have actually what I think is a very unique situation, idiosyncratic situation in Arabia in the late 6th, early 7th century, according to which Christianity was spreading quite dramatically, actually. And the more we look at inscriptions and the more archaeological work that is done in Saudi Arabia, the more we're finding signs of Christianity. There's just great Ahmed Jalad of Ohio State University has done great work on this. Other scholars like Christian Robin in Paris has done great work on this. I mean, we're just finding signs of Christianity everywhere. Really, although there's no serious archaeological work that's been done in Mecca, but I mean, we're getting very close to Mecca with these inscriptions.
Right.
I think was Christianity in Mecca. So Christianity is there, but we have no signs of an Arabic Bible. First sign, Sidney Griffith is sort of the ultimate authority on this, of emeritus from Catholic University. The Bible is first translated probably in the late 8th century, so over 100 years after Muhammad's death, and probably in Palestine among the Melkite communities there. So, and I would say the Quran itself points to this. The Quran obviously engages really robustly with the biblical tradition, and we could speak more about this. I mean, I think the Quran is sort of saturated with biblical ideas, but notice that it never refers, with one possible exception, to a biblical book. It doesn't refer to the Gospels by name. It doesn't seem to have any awareness that there are 4 Gospels that all Christians universally recognize as canonical in its day. Doesn't seem to recognize that, or at least it doesn't mention it. It doesn't have any sense of the collection of Paul's, which in the Eastern Church was one collection of Paul's epistles. Simply known as the collection of the Apostle. It doesn't have a sense of how Christians or Jews would speak of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Jews, they would call it the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Christians would speak about the Pentateuch, the historical books, the prophetic books, the wisdom books. It doesn't seem to have any sense of this. The only book that it seems to mention by name, and we could speak more about this if it's interesting, is the Psalms, of course. It does associate David with the Psalms, but it doesn't seem to have a sense, even though there's possibly a quotation, maybe the only biblical quotation in the Quran in Surah 21 of a verse in the Psalms. I think it's Psalm 39. I mean, that's the one exception that sort of proves the rule, that the Quran just doesn't have intimate knowledge of the Bible. I mean, imagine it mentions all the characters from Adam to Jesus, almost, but I mean, there's basically no biblical quotations except for that one line from the Psalms. So, and that, I don't know if it's still interesting or if
it is. Now, let me pick your brain. That is very interesting. Does it quote it verbatim?
Well, the line is, it's Quran 21, verse 10 something, I think. One of your listeners will find it and maybe put it in the comments. Right. But it says something to the effect, we have written in the Psalms after the remembrance, لَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزُّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ is the Arabic. We have written in the Psalms after the remembrance, as for the earth, my righteous servants will inherit it. لقد كتبنا في الكتاب في الزبور من بعد الذكر إن الأرض لا يرثها عبادي الصالحون, something like that. So, and that's very close to a line in the Psalms. I believe there's something in the prophets, maybe in Isaiah, and then finally in the Beatitudes, of course, it's taken up by Jesus. It's very close to the Gospel of Matthew, I think, in chapter 5 of Matthew.
Right, yeah, I'm aware of that.
I mean, it's not an exact quotation. The phrase "Ibadi as-salihun," my righteous servants, that's not there in the Psalms. So it's not really verbatim, but it's pretty close. And that it mentions the Psalms is very suggestive. It actually says in the Psalms. Wow. Now, just to add one thing, one complication. This is probably getting too far into the weeds, and so everyone, I apologize to all your viewers and listeners. But the word for Psalms in the Quran is a bit of a problem. The word is zabur, and it doesn't correspond with the Hebrew word, which is mizmor. Wow. Although it sounds close to it. It probably comes from an Arabic root, which just means the writings. But it is, I mean, this verse seems to connect it to the Psalms, and that it's associated with David. The Quran explicitly says we gave the Zabur to David, and the traditional association of David with the Psalms makes one think that this word Zabur must mean Psalms, but it's not actually cognate with the other Semitic languages like Hebrew and Syriac, their words for Psalms.
That truly is incredible. I do want to kind of rewind to something that you mentioned earlier that to me it's incredibly fascinating. The clay birds being made. please correct me if I am wrong, but does that likely, by the way that it's told in the Quran, does it seem like that is being adopting the Syriac infancy gospel narratives, or is there kind of is it kind of different within the Quran? Because that's what it does seem like to me, which would then bring me to the question of, okay, well, how acquainted would Muhammad have been with the rest of the Gospels? Did he have was he aware of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or only pieces of some of them? To me, it's a fascinating question.
Right,
what are your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah. Great question. Terrific question, William. So, yeah, I mean, the story of Jesus creating a bird from clay and then notably bring it to life through his breath.
Yeah.
Through his breath. I mean, it's just an extraordinary report by the Qur'an.
Yeah.
And it seems to me to be something like a vestige of a very theologically rich, symbolic story in the apocryphal, as you mentioned, the apocryphal infancy gospels. And I believe the account is both in Greek and Syriac infancy gospels. Yeah, so in the Christian context, I mean, there are 2 points of this story, but both points redound to the divinity of the infant Christ. He does it as a child. And one point is that he acts as God does in creating Adam from clay and bringing him to life through his breath in Genesis. Exactly. Yeah. And then the other point is in the infancy gospels, he does this on a Sabbath. And so it shows that the Son of God or Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, that he has authority over the commandments given by God. Who would have authority over the commandments given by God? Only God. Yeah. So clearly the story is meant to redound to Jesus's divinity. In the Quran, I'm not saying the Quran is actually a Christian text and Muslims misunderstand it, which some Christians have gone there. I wouldn't go there.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't either.
But the Quran does add this phrase, he does this by God's permission. So, and in 2 ways, in Quran chapter 3, the divine voice of the Quran says that Jesus did this bi-iznillah, by the permission of God. And then in Quran chapter 5, God probably on the day of judgment, speaking to Jesus, reflects back to Jesus's ministry and says, you did this by my permission, to Jesus. Okay. So the Quran clearly, by adding that line about permission, wants to undercut what even the Quran's author recognized as a story that's pregnant with Christian theological meaning. Sure. So we're concerned with that. Interesting question, William, is why is this in the Quran at all? Why did the Quran's author choose to include this when, it could complicate things or confuse. In fact, it has complicated things because Muslims, need to say, well, yes, he creates a bird from clay. This is the only time the word to create is used by someone other than Allah in the Quran. Or is attributed to someone other than Allah. Probably the Quran is interested in stories in which animals are used to illustrate in different ways the evidentiary miracles of prophets. So I could go on and give you some examples. Quran's really interested in stories with animals. I think this may sound silly and you may lose all respect for me, but I actually think the Quran's author was just interested in animals and liked stories involving animals. So anyway.
Right. No, that would make a whole lot of sense. But I am really glad that you focused on that incredible, then important Christological aspect that, in my opinion, I've read those I've read that gospel, infancy gospel, which is an apocryphal one. It's not part of our canonical texts. And I've read others like it as well. And very clearly to me, it is attempting to make a Christological point of Christ being divine, which all the more so confuses me that it is in the Quran. But I'm glad you focused on that because it very clearly is hearkening to life being breathed into God's creation from Genesis, and you find it in other passages as well. There's a particular way God breathes life into creation. So those are all fantastic points you make. One of the very interesting thing that that I am fascinated with is this one right here from the Quran. And when God said, "O Jesus, son of Mary, did you say unto me, take me and my mother as gods apart from God? He said, to you be glory. It is not mine to say what I have no right to." Now, that got cut off right before I could put 116 and 117. But this is an incredibly famous text brought up when dialoguing with when Catholics and Muslims dialoguing. I'll add even our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters, because to me, as a Catholic, I read it and I think that this is very clearly calling out Catholics for their deep veneration of Holy Mary. And to me, it seems like Muhammad is saying, well, look, this is downright worship, and worship should not be given to Mary. We even have a text. Off the top of my head, I don't remember where it is. You probably do remember where it says that Mary ate food. To me, really clearly emphasizing that Mary was created, which all Catholics recognize. Now, if that is the case, to me, this seems like a problematic text within the Quran. I don't think it's as easy as just swiping away and accusing Catholics, because then you're going to have to accuse Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox. You're going to have to accuse a lot of Christians of worshiping Mary, because a lot of apostolic Christians give great veneration to Mary. So what is this, in your opinion? Is this an apparent error? Is this what is going on here? Or, as some modern day Muslim scholars say, no, it is not referring to Catholics. It is rather referring to some fringe group, like the Coloridians, which did worship Mary. It is not referring to any mainstream Christian group. What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Reynolds?
Yeah, terrific introduction to this problem, which you rightly state as an old one. So, I mean, it's not just old in the sense of 100 years and, Orientalists and missionaries debating with Muslims doing dawah and things like that. It's old as in from the very earliest period of the Muslim-Christian conversation. Christians at a very early point noticed this verse and saw it as an error, a fundamental error of the Qur'an in its attempt to describe the Trinity. And the assumption is, by these early Christian thinkers, that Muhammad, whom they assume is the author of the Qur'an, could not understand the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, or in particular the begetting of the Father's begetting of the Son, and could only imagine like biological procreation when we speak of a father-son relationship. And so the whole Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit was lost on him, and he could only imagine that Mary must have been the wife of God the Father, and together they produced the Son. So the Trinity is a sort of family Trinity. There's another verse in the Quran that says, how could God have a son if he has no sahiba, which means a consort or a wife? So they draw on that, and they would put it all together and say, look, sorry to say this, but your master Muhammad has this confused notion, obviously doesn't understand what the Trinity is. Sometimes this can be expressed in a sort of condescending way to Muslims, like our thought is too sophisticated, our sort of sophisticated theology, and someone like Muhammad wasn't able to get. So, I mean, that's some of the backstory. There's actually a Muslim theologian known as Abdul Jabbar, who writes about the year 1000, who's aware of these Christian attacks, and he seeks to fight back precisely with the line that you suggested, William.
Right.
He says, well, no, what's going on here, first of all, is God only poses a question to Jesus. So you can't assert that God is affirming this teaching, only that he's asking a question of Jesus to provoke a response from him. So that's his first point. And then the second point is, he says, oh, and by the way, especially the group he calls the Jacobites, so what we would name today as Miaphysites or Oriental Orthodox.
Right.
He says, well, you folks in your liturgy, and he actually, this really is extraordinary. He writes this book in the year 995. It's called The Critique of Christian Origins. Mm-hmm. He actually quotes from the liturgy in which there's veneration of Mary. And he says, listen, the language you Christians use for Mary, any sensible person seeing all of this, reverential language towards her would say that they're revering a god or a goddess, not a human. So, that's a traditional line. I tend to think that the Quran is pretty creatively engaging with Christian veneration for Mary. I tend to think it's not responding to some strange Christian sect which deified Mary. And as you mentioned, there's another line which again Mary and Jesus are brought together. It's earlier in Surah 5, I think it's verse 75, but you can confirm, one of your viewers will, where the Quran says Mary and Jesus both used to eat food. It says they both used to eat food, which clearly, just as you said, is a way of expressing that they must be humans. So I would see it this way. I don't think this is an error or misunderstanding of the Trinity, although I don't know to what extent the Quran's author had knowledge of the Trinity. There's another line in chapter 4 verse 171 where the Quran's author says do not say three. There's also Quran chapter 5 verse 73. Maybe it's there it is. Both used to eat food in 575. So I'm with you on this one, William. I think the Quran is creatively, almost hyperbolically, almost caricaturing Christian belief in a provocative way.
And that would open the door to, particularly for Catholics and anyone else that venerate Mary, to say, hey, wait a minute. Well, we don't worship her. We venerate Mary.
Right.
According to exactly the way the Old Testament, the Jews gave veneration, which is, very well, within Catholicism and Orthodoxy, we refer to it as douleuo, which is religious service veneration, not laturo, which is exclusive to deity, to God alone. I agree with you there. And in fact, there really is no evidence from what I've looked at. Maybe you found on your end, but I'm very well aware of the group that is mentioned by Saint Epiphanius, or Epiphanius, however you want to pronounce it, the Collyridians. But that was several centuries before Muhammad. Mm-hmm. And contemporary Saint John Damascene in his heresies, when he's laying them out, very clearly seems to indicate that the Collyridians are a group of the past. They're no longer extant. There's no evidence that they're extant. So I do think that this is referring to the Catholics. Or even if you want to say Catholics or Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox,
Apostolic Christianity. Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think, William, if I could jump in there, if you don't mind,
definitely.
There's another point is there's an unfortunate tendency of non-Muslim observers of the Quran to explain everything by finding a Christian heresy behind some turn of phrase in the Quran, and it's almost becomes ridiculous. To the point where, Muhammad only met heretics, but he met every kind of heretic. Left and right and center, he met them all. And now part of this idea is connected, especially among sort of more rigorous scholarship, is connected to an old notion that, the Byzantine emperors were effective enforcers of orthodoxy. So the heretics, you could see the logic here. The heretics would have fled beyond the borders of the empire into the Arabian desert. There's a saying out there, which I've never actually found in any patristic author, but you hear quoted in secondary scholarship. I would love to see someone explain to me where it originally came from, that Arabia, the Latin expression is Arabia Heresium Ferax. Arabia is the bearer of, or the womb, literally Ferax is womb, the womb of heresies.
Right.
So, so there's this idea that, heretics were just running around the desert, had their communities all around. And I think that the most sensible way of understanding the Quran is engaging in a complicated way with, as you describe them, apostolic Christians. So the major communities of the East, the Church of the East, the Melkites, and the Jacobites.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that that's a real, in my opinion, a distortion of Arabia. And I've never found that quote either. I've heard it. As far as I'm aware, I don't think it, unless it's a real distortion of something having been said. I have never found it. Even
William. Also, I would like to add one more thing, if you bear with me. I know I'm being too
You're great. You're
long-winded, but just one other point. I actually think this idea is. I mean, someone can rebuke me on this. I'm open to correction. I really am. But I actually think this idea, and I love Protestants, and I have a heart for ecumenism. I'm so grateful for the ways that Protestants, remind us of fidelity to Scripture and other things. But I actually think this idea of heretics running around is part of a larger caricature of the Eastern Church that was popular among Protestant scholars. That the Eastern Church was, both the mainstream communities, the Church of the East, Melkites and Jacobites, and all of the heretics. The Eastern Church was just a mess. The whole church from the end of the apostolic age to Martin Luther was just a mess of corruption and decadence. And so, and this idea that you see among scholars, even among some really well-respected scholars like Bell, his first name's escaped me, Richard Bell, a Scottish scholar. He advances this idea. He wrote The Origin of Islam in its Christian Environment. And he wrote a translation of the Qur'an. He has this idea. William Weir has this idea. Others too, the Protestant scholars will say, if only Muhammad had met a sort of respectable, they don't use this language, but the vibe they give up, if only Muhammad had met a respectable Protestant, then he would have converted. He would have accepted the gospel and the Lord, and Islam wouldn't be here. And so I think this idea actually of the Eastern Church as a mess comes from a certain tradition of Protestant scholarship.
Yeah, no doubt. And it really doesn't match up to the historical record at all. And I think that I know, because I do have near and dear friends that are Oriental Orthodox that do tune in. I think they're going to really appreciate you referring to them as Miaphysites, because a lot of people sometimes confuse them for being Monophysites. They are not Monophysites. So they would prefer to be called Miaphysites. And as they know very well, because I've had some of their top scholars here in my show, despite us utilizing different language when it comes to Christology, you're going to find we agree pretty much on all of the basics, including on Mariology as well. Great group of apostolic Christians. One thing that I would like to add, it really depends on what Muslim scholar you run into, because I have downloaded, and I'd recommend, here's one thing that, I got during my debate. After the debate, I went back to look at the comments, and some people were saying, well, how on earth could William recommend people get a copy of the Quran? Look, I do apologetic work. I want to know what the best scholarship is offering so that I can defend my faith. I do recommend people get the best when it comes to Quranic studies, Protestant, anything, even atheistic studies. One particular Quran I've recommended people get, because they can get it for free, it's called the Majestic Quran. It was translated by the gentleman that I debated. And I like it because every chapter has an introduction. And you find that when I'm dialoguing with him, right before you get to the section we just read of this one right here, right there, you will find him making a claim. And then during our discussion, also making the claim that, well, yes, this very clearly is hitting out at people that worship Mary. And, well, you know what? Even the Catholics worship Mary, and they deified Christ at the Council of Nicaea. Just a very old kind of caricatures that you hear, despite the fact that very clearly in the Gospels and the early fathers, very clearly, even in the letters of St. Paul, if they want to go with that, saying, well, we only trust them, the Gospels are way later, you still find Christ presented as Almighty God. But I've noticed that there is also a stream of Islamic scholarship that doesn't offer caricatures, that tries to further dialogue and further scholarship. With that in mind, in your opinion, when it came to Muhammad's Christology, what kind of a Christology would Muhammad have been working with? In your opinion, and I want to say this with all respect, does it seem like he adopted various Christologies of the area? Because one thing that I've heard that I find nonsensical is that, well, you know what, Muhammad was a modern day Nestorian. I don't think people understood what Nestorius believed when they make that particular kind of claim, or what the Assyrian Church of the East believes, because it's very definitely does not match up. What kind of a Christology do you think Muhammad would have been working with? Yeah.
Great question. Yeah, first, I'd really like to affirm what you stated in regard to Muslim conversation partners and friends. It's just important to note. If one just lives on social media, you'll run into waves of sort of dawa folks out there.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes referred to as dawa bros. So they're doing just dawa or Muslim evangelism. And sometimes those conversations are not very fruitful because there's not really open hearts and minds. But there are so many great, especially this new generation of young Muslim scholars in the academy, so university-based folks, just terrific historical critical scholarship from Muslims who may be believing of different sorts, or not. They may be just from a Muslim background. But people like Shadi Nasser at Harvard is terrific. Mohsen Goudarzi, also at Harvard, is terrific. Saqib Hussain teaches at a Catholic University, Loyola Marymount in California. Imran al-Badawi at the University of Houston. Mehdi Azayas is in Europe, in Belgium, at another Catholic university at Louvain. There's such a great young generation of Muslim scholars. So I'd just like to commend you for that and just mention that generally, that, this is in some ways a really new phenomenon, that you have Muslim scholars studying the Quran with a historical critical perspective, many of whom have also studied Hebrew and Syriac, Greek, seek to understand the historical context in which the Quran emerged. Okay.
So let me interrupt briefly, because you made a great point there. So you have a very different world there compared to the sometimes very polemic-filled kind of garbage you find online, and then people that are actually doing real scholarship.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of experience both because, as you may know, I'm on Twitter, so I engage with the broader public. And,
gotcha. Okay.
And so, I try to just let some things just slide by.
Sure.
So there's a lot of dawah there, which, and sometimes also crass Christian apologetics that's not respectful, that I also just let slide by, just ignore.
Right.
But it's really remarkable. I don't want to maybe beat the drum too much, but there is a remarkable generation now of young Muslim, serious academic scholars. I'm very involved with a group called the International Quranic Studies Association. Its current executive director is another scholar by the name of Haytham Sidki, who's a real authority on Quran manuscripts. He's also part of this generation. So there's something really extraordinary happening in that regard. And so maybe enough on it. On Christology.
Oh, that was great.
On Christology, it's not a direct answer to your question, but it just to give a really candid answer about what I think goes on in the Quran is, my sense is that all of the prophets in the Quran, all of them, from Adam, if we consider him a prophet, although he's never named such, through Jesus, are shaped for basically the sole purpose of giving reasons to believe in Muhammad.
Yeah.
So I think every single, including Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, even David, they are all shaped simply to give reasons to believe Muhammad. So they have a Muhammadan, to use that expression as an adjective, Muhammadan features. The stories told about them are meant to say that, the same thing is going on with Muhammad right now. Are you going to choose for or against the prophet? Are you going to make a better decision than the Israelites of Jesus's time, or the people of the earlier prophets who rejected their prophet? Or are you going to, get on the right side of history, as some people might put it, and choose Muhammad? So I think the Christology is sort of a secondary thought in terms of the relationship between the divine and the human in Christ. The point is that Jesus needs to serve the Muhammadan argument of the Quran. And so necessarily, not only his divinity, and this is a point that's sometimes missed, it's not only of his divinity, but his redemptive quality is set aside. Notice that the cross
Yeah.
The suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ is basically, it's not even really directly refuted, it's just sort of set aside so that he's made into a prophet who anticipates Muhammad.
Yeah, which to me, those are all very, very good points that you bring up. The reason I say that they're very good points is because it shows that really, to me, Muhammad really wanted to forge his own path. Even if he was aware of, and it does seem like he was aware of some scripture at least, as you brought up earlier, maybe he just really was aware of it, didn't agree with it, or maybe he wasn't aware of it, or maybe he was aware of it and wanted to forge his own path. Would it be fair to say that there are some areas where he was very clearly aware of, but maybe disagreed with? Because to me, it's very, very obvious to me that Muhammad was aware of the proto-evangelium of James. It's very obvious. And being aware of it, but by the way, it's not scripture, that's an apocryphal text, one from the 100s. But being aware of that text, as he takes the mother of Mary's name there, he doesn't choose to adopt the name Joachim, which, as we talked about earlier, became built into the liturgical life of the faith.
Right.
So to me, it seems like he's trying to forge his own path. And that to me would, from a Catholic perspective, as one that does apologetics, would be problematic, because you're very, very clearly creating your own religion that doesn't line up with the Christians who, the apostolic Christians that were left the faith, that were taught and trained by the apostles who walked and talked with Christ. So would that be a fair assessment, or is that really just a very, is there anybody in scholarship that would take that position?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it's difficult, and I try to resist the temptation to impute to Muhammad motives, or it's just very difficult to because our outside of the Quran. I mean, what you'd want in order to understand text A are other texts or documents, ideally, that provide a context for it. Yeah. We're getting a little bit of this now with the inscriptions. Some people think pre-Islamic poetry is a way forward, that we can know things from pre-Islamic poetry. I tend to doubt the whole corpus of pre-Islamic poetry. I tend to think it's all later works from the Islamic period attributed to pre-Islamic figures. So how can we with confidence imagine what Muhammad's motives are in engaging with the biblical tradition? Something you've mentioned several times in our chat today is really important, though. I mean, it's to note that the Quran doesn't seem to distinguish between canonical and non-canonical traditions. Yeah. So, for example, in the Annunciation scene in Quran 3 and a little bit in Quran 19, the Quran seems to be pretty close to Luke, to a canonical gospel. But then in what follows in Quran 3, in what precedes it, actually, the story of Mary's nativity, for example, the story of her receiving food from an angel in the temple. The Quran doesn't say from an angel, but I believe the Proto-Evangelium does. I mean, that's a non-canonical source. The story of Jesus speaking as an infant, speaking miraculously as a newborn baby, is coming from a non-canonical tradition related to the Gospel pseudo Matthew. So, it's very difficult to know if the Quran, for example, was knowingly taking from non-canonical sources, but because it rejected the authority of the church, didn't see them as any less important. That's a possible position. Or maybe the Quran's author simply was hearing traditions orally from storytellers. I mean, there was no Instagram or YouTube back in the day. And so people were telling stories all the time, sitting around drinking coffee or tea and telling stories and hearing about different traditions. And these would have circulated. And there are a couple of examples. You note one of them with the Proto-Evangelium in the story of Mary in Quran 3, where the Quran is really following closely a Christian text. Another one that's really, two more in chapter 18, the story of the sleepers of Ephesus,
Mhm.
And then the story of Alexander and his travels, Alexander the Great and his travels. I mean, the Quran is really almost line by line, obviously in its own Arabic expression, but almost line by line, following the narrative in these Syriac Christian sources. So, yeah, there's a lot one can notice from a literary perspective, but in order to make sort of definitive historical proclamations, that's a challenge.
Let me ask you one final question, Dr. Reynolds, and I've been incredibly edified by your time today, by your incredible knowledge. This is a good one. Now, we talked about earlier what kind of people that Muhammad would have encountered in Arabia, but in your estimation, in your studies, would he have been exposed at all to the liturgical life of the church? And why are liturgies and sacraments, why are they absent in Islam?
Right. Oh, wow. What a great question, William. Okay, I think I can address the first part of the question better. Okay. There are some allusions to at least the monastic life. I mean, the most famous one is Quran chapter 5, verse 82, where the Quran refers to monks, ruhban, and then it uses this word qasisin, which is usually translated as priests. In modern Arabic, it refers to a priest or a pastor. And it says in a positive way, they are not arrogant. And there's also a verse in Quran 57, which refers to monasticism. But most provocatively, there are two passages. One is in Quran 22, where the Quran basically regrets the fact that churches, and the word it uses is not kana'is, which is a modern standard Arabic word for churches, but it uses bi'a, which is the ancient Arabic word for churches, and monasteries. It uses a word coming from Ethiopic, somia, soeme is the plural. So it regrets that churches and monasteries are destroyed.
Oh, wow.
And then there's a passage of Quran 24, so starting in verse 35, which is a famous light verse, but your viewers might be interested in the verses which follow that, which in my mind is clearly alluding to the practice of monks. It speaks of men who give up the life of commerce for a life of prayer. I'm paraphrasing. I think that might be in verse 36 or 37 of Quran 24. It seems to clearly be referring to life of prayer. So that says to me that there is a monastic life in the context of the Quran. The Quran is aware, and generally, despite the verse in Surah 57, is generally positive about monks and monasticism. Yeah, and then I think you're right that the Quran doesn't have sacraments. It's hard to speak, or Islam generally doesn't have sacraments. I mean, maybe something to be continued, because there's a lot that could be said about Islamic ritual practice. The closest maybe Islam comes to sacraments are the rites of the pilgrimage, particularly the slaughtering of an animal. But Muslims generally would say this is a ritual slaughtering and not a sacrifice that's meant to have an idea that it in some way atones for sins. I mean, the standard idea is it's just a ritual sacrifice that's done in imitation of Abraham. But there's more to be said about Islam, sacraments, and practice. And I've probably gone on too far already and tried the patience of you and your listeners.
That will be a show to be continued in the future. Dr. Reynolds, I have been incredibly edified by your time, by your presence. You've been great, and I greatly appreciate it, brother. You've been fantastic. I look forward to having you back on again, my friend. Thank you so much for your time, brother. But hey, hold on. Before we wrap up, put in a plug. Anything you may be working on, you want to point the audience to, because I know a lot of people are going to watch your show. They're going to be really edified. And by the time this airs for everyone, down below, there'll be a link to whatever you put in a plug for, brother. You want to put in a plug for a book, webpage, YouTube page, anything. The floor is yours right now, brother.
Super. Thank you, William. That's very generous and gracious of you. And I'll accept the invitation to put in a plug. So very quickly, two of my own things and then one of a colleague's. One is I have the second edition of my book, Emergence of Islam, is out. So hopefully we can put in a link to that, and hopefully your viewers will find that useful. So it's Emergence of Islam, the second edition. Go for the second edition, not the first, by Fortress Press. And then I do have a YouTube, which is called Exploring the Qur'an and the Bible. And then I have some colleagues at Notre Dame and a group in Milan who have started a YouTube as well. Really short but very beautiful animated videos about Islamic Christianity. And that YouTube is called Reasons for Our Hope.
Incredible. By the time this airs, likely Friday evening, there will be links down there. Brother, thank you so much for your time. Look forward to talking to you again. God bless you, brother.
Thank you, William. Always a pleasure.